And welcome to FISM News. I'm Samuel Case.
And I'm Renata Kiss.
And tonight, Congress passes a stopgap spending bill.
Meanwhile, Israel signals plans to invade Lebanon.
And New York City Mayor Eric Adams is indicted. All right, and we begin tonight in D.C., where despite some Republican opposition, Congress overwhelmingly passed a short-term spending bill yesterday to avoid a government shutdown next week. It passed the Senate 78-18 after also passing in the House 341-82. Here's House Speaker Mike Johnson following the vote.
Today, the House did the necessary thing. We took the initiative and passed a clean, narrow 3-month CR to prevent the Senate from jamming us with another bloated bill. While continuing resolutions are never ideal, none of us like them, it's not a way to run a railroad, it allows Congress to continue serving the American people through the election.
The stopgap measure maintains current spending levels through December 20th, which caused some Republicans to object, saying it will lead to a last-minute omnibus package right before Christmas. However, Speaker Johnson is promising that that will not be the case.
But I want to assure everyone, and I've said this multiple times this week, we are not going to return to the Christmas omnibus spending tradition, and that's a commitment I've made to everyone.
Meanwhile, President Biden is expected to sign the bill as soon as possible.
Elsewhere, Vice President Kamala Harris sat down for her first solo interview with MSNBC, where she talked about her economic plan, or at least she tried to. While she rehashed her vague dreams for the American people, she dodged important questions regarding taxes and price controls. MSNBC's Stephanie Ruhle asked Harris where she plans to borrow money from if she can't raise corporate taxes and Republicans take the Senate, to which Harris responded, "But we're going to have to raise corporate taxes."
If you can't raise corporate taxes, or if GOP takes control of the Senate, where do you get the money to do that? Do you still go forward with those plans and borrow?
Well, but we're going to have to raise corporate taxes, and we're going to have to make sure that the biggest corporations and billionaires pay their fair share. That's just it.
Ruhle likewise challenged her on her price gouging. She asked Harris how she would implement price controls on big corporations without alarming free market supporters. The vice president replied that she would never apologize for going after the few powerful corporations that, in her view, exploit Americans.
I am never going to apologize for going after companies and corporations that take advantage of the desperation of the American people. And as Attorney General, I saw this happen, where those few companies, not the majority, not most, but those few companies that would take advantage of the desperation of people and jack up prices. Yeah, I'm going to go after them. Yes, I'm going to go after them.
While Ruhle challenged Harris during the interview, the Liberal host previously took her side by telling TV host Bill Maher that Trump is still a threat to democracy.
And speaking of Trump and threats, we're going to turn our attention now to actual threats against the former president himself, as a scathing new Senate report says the Secret Service had ample opportunity to prevent July's shooting in Butler, Pennsylvania. This is the one that wounded Trump and also tragically killed a rally-goer. The bipartisan Senate report calls the entire shooting entirely foreseeable and preventable, even revealing that the Secret Service was actually warned of a, quote, credible threat just days before. The report also details how agents failed to secure the roof from which the shooter fired at Trump, despite warnings from local law enforcement saying that it might be a potential security risk. The report also comes the same day that Congress approved a new security funding bill for presidential candidates in light of the increased threat level against Donald Trump, though Speaker Johnson says the funding will be conditional on continued cooperation from the Secret Service with congressional oversight investigations.
We're providing Donald Trump with the protection that he needs in the face of dangerous threats of would-be assassins and terrorist regimes like Iran. That is a new spending amount in the CR, $231 million. It will be dedicated to the protection of presidential candidates, and it is limited to that, and it is contingent upon the Secret Service's complete cooperation with our oversight investigations over these assassination attempts.
And along those lines, Secretary of State Antony Blinken said yesterday that the U.S. is intensely tracking ongoing Iranian threats against current and former American politicians, including former President Trump.
This is something we've been tracking very intensely for a long time, an ongoing threat by Iran against a number of senior officials, including former government officials like President Trump and some people who are currently serving the administration. So it's something we take very, very seriously. We're looking at it very carefully. I don't have any further information to share.
Iran has been a persistent national security threat, and law enforcement officials worry that the country is planning assassinations of former Trump officials and even Trump himself. Trump shared on Truth Social yesterday that Iran has big threats on his life. He continued by saying, quote, "The entire U.S. military is watching and waiting. Moves were already made by Iran that didn't work out, but they will try again." Iran's threats have intensified since the U.S. killed the commander of their Islamic Revolutionary Guard under the Trump administration in 2020. CNN reports that the former senior Trump officials have had strict security protection since leaving office.
And before we go to a break here, 10 Democrats joined 209 House Republicans in passing a resolution yesterday condemning the Biden administration's withdrawal from Afghanistan in 2021. That resolution condemns, quote, decision-making and execution failures that ultimately resulted in the deaths of 13 American troops and the abandonment of over $7 billion in military equipment now in the hands of the Taliban. That resolution follows Monday's testimony from House Foreign Affairs Chairman Michael McCaul, who said Congress must hold the administration accountable.
But more than 3 years after the withdrawal from Afghanistan, President Biden, Vice President Harris have yet to hold a single person accountable for this catastrophic failure of epic proportions. When asked just this month if there had been any accountability for the disastrous withdrawal, National Security Advisor Kirby responded, quote, "We've all held ourselves accountable," end of quote. That answer doesn't fool anybody. If the administration refuses to hold itself accountable, then the duly elected representatives of the American people must.
All right, and up next, Israel is signaling a possible invasion of Lebanon. We'll get to the details on that story and more after this.
There are moments in life that define us. Choices determine the courses we take. Choices that create life, or those that save a life. And some make life worthwhile. There are decisions to stay, or to go, to remain the same, or to grow. Sometimes we pray and make peace. Other times we take a stand for what we believe. In celebration, mourning, triumph, and defeat, we are invested in every decision we seek. Despite differences, we have one thing in common: the desire to do all for the glory of God. Keep your wallet aligned with your heart and your investments in harmony with your faith. Timothy Plan, biblically responsible mutual funds, ETFs, and retirement plans. Before investing, carefully consider a fund's investment objective, risks, charges, and expenses contained in the prospectus available at timothyplan.com. Read carefully before investing.
On January 21st, 1824, a baby boy was born in Clarksburg, Virginia. His name was Thomas Jackson, and during the American Civil War, he would become the second most famous general of the Confederate Army after General Robert E. Lee. Most people do not recognize him by his given name, but many do know him by his legendary nickname, Stonewall Jackson.
To watch more episodes of A Moment in History, go to FISM.tv.
Tragically, and all too often, a young mother in an unplanned pregnancy is in crisis. You can be there for her by giving a life-changing ultrasound through Preborn. Seeing her baby on ultrasound is a game changer, doubling the chances she will choose life from 40% to 80%. For only $28 a month, less than $1 a day, you can show a mom her baby on ultrasound.
And welcome back to FISM News. I'm Samuel Case. We're going to kick off this segment here with some updates in the Middle East. Israel is now signaling new plans to invade southern Lebanon as the next phase of its battle against the terror group Hezbollah, which has been firing rockets into northern Israel for almost a year now. IDF Chief of Staff Herzi Halevi told northern troops yesterday, quote, "We are now preparing the process of a maneuver, which means your military boots, your maneuvering boots will enter enemy territory, enter villages that Hezbollah has prepared as large military outposts." It marks the latest in Israel's escalation against Hezbollah, prompting U.S. fears of a full-scale war.
An all-out war is possible, but I think there's also the opportunity, or still in play, to have a settlement that could fundamentally change the whole region. There needs to be a two-state solution. Ultimately, it needs to happen. There's a way to do it, and they have a possibility.
That was President Biden speaking on The View yesterday. Meanwhile, earlier today, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu rejected a ceasefire proposal by both the U.S. and France, saying Israel will continue fighting, quote, with full force until its goals are achieved.
Meanwhile, Lebanon boasted yesterday that they launched a missile against Israel's Mossad headquarters in Tel Aviv. The missile was intercepted before any damage was done. Hezbollah posted on Telegram that they launched a Qatar-1 ballistic missile in retaliation against Israel's strike last week that blew up thousands of terrorist pagers and injured just as many people in the process. Hezbollah wrote in a post on Telegram that they targeted the Israeli intelligence headquarters for assassinating Hezbollah leaders and blowing up pagers. While sirens did go off in the Tel Aviv region, the IDF aerial defense area shut down the missile before it could hurt anyone. This comes as the IDF took out another senior Hezbollah leader this afternoon. Mohammed Sur was the head of the terror group's Air Force unit.
And while the fighting continues, Israel also continues to be a focus at the UN's General Assembly this week. FISM's Ian Patrick has more.
Well, the United Nations General Assembly continues to be a soapbox of sorts for countries to use against Israel. Multiple nations have used their addresses to the General Assembly to levy critiques and condemnations against Israel. One early example was Jordan's address given by King Abdullah II bin al-Hussein, who fiercely tore into Israel for stepping over what he said was the red line multiple times in what is its response to the October 7th terror attacks.
The attacks of October 7th on Israeli civilians last year were condemned by countries all over the world, including Jordan. But the unprecedented scale of terror unleashed on Gaza since that day is beyond any justification. This Israeli government has killed more children, more journalists, more aid workers, and more medical personnel than any other war in recent memory. Palestinians have borne more than 57 years of occupation and oppression. During this time, the Israeli government has been allowed to cross one red line after another. But the brutality of the war on Gaza has forced the world to look closer. Now many see Israel through the eyes of its victims. And the contradiction, the paradox, is too jarring.
The foreign ministers of Jordan and Egypt also released a joint statement which calls for the end of what it called Israeli aggression on Gaza and condemned the same aggression on Lebanon. Part of that statement reads, quote, "The ministers called on the international community and the Security Council to assume their relevant responsibilities to stop the war and indicated that Israel bears full responsibility for this deterioration, which will have serious consequences for the entire region." Other nations have levied similar criticism and called for an end to hostilities, if not from the podium, then through statements. Some of these nations include ones in the Middle East, such as the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, but nations from across the world like Colombia have also weighed in on the matter. All the while, Iran continues to critique Israel since the beginning of the General Assembly itself, blaming the nation for the tensions in the region. Israel continues to defend itself, saying the ultimate goal for its war is to provide security and sustainability for itself, as well as the region at large.
Our goal is to push Hezbollah from the fence, allow the residents to come back to the communities, and I hope we will be able to achieve it without using our military capabilities. If we can achieve it with diplomacy, it will be much better for Israel, much better for Lebanon. I'm not sure Hezbollah care much about the people in Lebanon or the Iranians, which I have seen the applause they received in the General Assembly. I'm not sure they will be happy about that, but for the sake of the Lebanese people and the Israelis, a diplomatic solution is much better for all.
But despite the popularity of what seems like condemning Israel at the UN, the nation did actually receive one ally in Argentinian President Javier Milei. The South American leader took the podium at the General Assembly to notably defend Israel, as well as to condemn the United Nations as a whole for what he said was a tragic path of socialist policymaking.
This was an organization that had essentially been thought up as a shield to protect the reign of men, and it became a leviathan with various tentacles purporting to decide not only what each nation state should do, but also how all the citizens in the world should live. What we're discussing in New York this week at the Summit of the Future is nothing more than going further down this tragic path, the tragic path that this institution has adopted. In this same house, that purports to defend human rights, we have also included bloody dictatorships in the Human Rights Council, including Cuba and Venezuela, without reproach. In this same house, which purports to defend the rights of women, we've allowed on CEDAW, the CEDAW committee, countries that punish their women just for showing their skin. In this same house that had voted against the state of Israel, which is the only country in the Middle East to defend a liberal democracy, we have simultaneously shown a total inability to respond to the scourge of terrorism.
This is Ian Patrick reporting for FISM News.
Thanks for that report, Ian. And while Israel remains the center of attention, China is trying to quietly rally supporters to help Russia win the war against Ukraine. A Ukrainian government document obtained by Politico says that China has been trying to take matters into its own hands and gain enough support for Russia so they could continue the war in Ukraine while occupying its territories. The document was based on an earlier joint plan between Brazil and China and is described as an international peace deal. In Washington, the Chinese embassy has denied rallying support for this plan, although the embassy spokesperson said that China supports all efforts conducive to a peaceful resolution of the crisis. The so-called peace plan is currently being shared with members of the UN General Assembly, and both the U.S. and Ukraine are against the deal.
At the same time, Russian President Vladimir Putin continues his saber-rattling towards the West with a veiled, not-so-veiled threat to use nuclear weapons. He said yesterday that Russia would consider it a joint attack, in his own words, when a nuclear-armed nation backs an attacking non-nuclear state, clearly referencing the U.S. and other nations currently supporting Ukraine. Putin also says that Russia is now considering changing its preconditions for its use of nuclear weapons. A top Ukrainian commander responded to this, saying Russia no longer has anything other than nuclear blackmail.
At the same time, China test-fired an intercontinental ballistic missile for the first time in 4 decades yesterday, after giving a heads-up to Western nations. Beijing launched the dummy warhead into the Pacific Ocean around Wednesday morning. They notified the U.S. and its allies of the test launch and issued a navigation warning to Japan 1 day before the drill. The unusual move comes as the U.S. committed to leaving a missile system in the Philippines. China strongly opposes this decision. However, the Pentagon praised China for giving the advance notification, saying it was a step in the right direction. Pentagon spokeswoman Sabrina Singh says they will now press for a more regularized notification arrangement.
What we can do here from the department is continue to press for a more regularized bilateral notification arrangement when it comes to ballistic missile and space launches. And this is something that we've proposed with the PRC, and it represents, a common sense confidence building measure. So we want to see these types of notifications continue.
And we have plenty more news coming up next. We'll be right back after a moment in history.
Welcome back to A Moment in History. I'm Seth Udinsky. Well, every first Tuesday in November, the United States holds its governmental elections. Now, depending on the year, there may be lower elections such as local or governmental or township. Others consist of elections for the Senate. And then every 4 years, the most important election in all the land occurs, where the office of the President of the United States is filled. So how did Election Day come about in the United States, and why the first Tuesday of November? Let's jump back in time to discover the answers. Now, the spirit behind Election Day is as old as the very ideals of America itself. We live not in an absolute monarchy where a king is chosen based on divine right or familial lineage, but in a constitutional republic where the people reserve the right to elect their own leaders. The year that elections begin to take shape as we know it is actually 1845, when Congress reserved the first Monday in November as the day for federal elections. Now, the reason November was chosen is because it was immediately after the harvesting season, which meant that farmers could leave their crops to make the journey to their local voting booths, which for some would actually take several hours at least, even up to a day. Now, why was Tuesday chosen instead of Monday? Well, for many Americans, it was simply a matter of convenience. Weekends were usually inconvenient because many Americans still attended church on Sunday. Who'd have thunk of such an idea like that? And by the middle of the week, usually that was also inconvenient because Wednesdays were typically actually the days that farmers would publicly sell their crops to make a profit. Therefore, the first Tuesday in November was chosen as the official election day of the United States. Now, Election Day has been the topic of much controversy in recent years, especially with the infamous influx of mail-in ballots in the 2020 election between Donald Trump and Joe Biden, an election that took place while the country was still heavily mired in the COVID-19 pandemic lockdowns. Still, the day is a reminder of the uniqueness of the American experience, where ordinary citizens hold power, tiny power, but power nonetheless, over the future of their country. Thanks so much for joining me once again for A Moment in History.
On the day I found I was pregnant, I was full of emotions and I just was so overwhelmed, and I don't know if I'm ready for this huge life-altering, changing commitment. I had individuals around me not wanting me to have this child. And somehow, and I was driving and I saw the Women's Help Center sign and I immediately turned in. That just took relief off of me, and I was like, you know what? It's gonna be okay. They gave me the confidence and the support that I needed to be able to go out and face the world. First time I held Finnegan, I just lit up with joy. I was so excited. This little boy that I had in my life, he is loving and generous. Watching him just grow and flourish into this incredible human being has just been so rewarding and so uplifting. Looking back, I don't know what I would do without him, because I needed him more than I think he needed me.
Do you know what you are supporting when you purchase mutual funds and stocks? Think about it. When you invest in a company, you make a decision to support the things that that company supports. And it may not be things that you agree with. Financial Issues is a ministry teaching people like you how to invest biblically, responsibly, keeping your investments clear of companies that may support an ungodly agenda. Learn more by going to financialissues.org. Financialissues.org.
And welcome back to FISM News. I'm Renata Kish. Well, let's continue with some national news. New York City Mayor Eric Adams has been indicted on federal corruption charges. As of this reporting, it is unknown what exact charges he faces. Federal investigations hinged partly on Adams' involvement with the Turkish government to receive illegal foreign donations. When the indictment is announced, Adams will be the first mayor of New York City charged with a federal crime while in office. His indictment comes just a few months before a highly competitive mayoral primary.
At the same time, a federal judge has now approved a $600 million settlement as of yesterday for victims of last year's toxic train derailment in East Palestine, Ohio. Nearly 55,000 claimants have filed for the class action settlement, but critics say the deal actually ends up protecting train company Norfolk Southern more than providing long-term care for the community.
You saw the system work as designed, not as it should today. And what I mean by that, the protection and enrichment of billion-dollar companies and plaintiffs' attorneys at expense of the people of East Palestine.
That was Scott Smith, a Government Accountability Project whistleblower who found elevated dioxin levels following the disaster. The EPA has called him a quote-unquote fake scientist, but his organization claims that residents are now at an increased risk level of cancer because of the accident.
And in the world of business, it's big tech versus big tech as Google files an antitrust complaint against Microsoft in the European Union. Google accuses its rival tech giant of using unfair licensing terms to lock customers into using its Azure cloud computing platform. The complaint alleges Microsoft puts steep penalties on using rival cloud providers. This stifles competition and harms cybersecurity and innovation, according to Google. Microsoft denies allegations, pointing to a recent multi-billion-dollar settlement with European cloud providers over similar concerns. The company president fired back that Google failed to convince companies to continue litigation and will also fail to persuade the European Commission. The EU's powerful regulation agency is not required to open a formal probe after reviewing the complaint.
And finally, more business news today. Another day, another company is abandoning its DEI policies. This time, the announcement comes from heavy equipment company Caterpillar, as a recent memo sent to company employees says from now on, all training, both formal and informal, must be focused on our business and designed to foster high performance and execution of our enterprise strategy. The move was once again spurred on by conservative activist Robbie Starbuck, who further detailed some of the new changes.
So in Caterpillar, you did have some woke trainings like this about gender ideology. That is going to change. You also had this type of propaganda about how to be an ally, Trans 101. That is not going to be forced on Caterpillar employees going forward. You also had privilege quizzes. This type of woke training and quizzing will no longer be happening. You will also not have propaganda like this, teaching children about far-left gender ideology. And sorry, not sorry to the woke folks, but chastising white people for explaining something by calling it white splaining and then demonizing it is no longer going to be allowed at Caterpillar. And yeah, your privilege quiz is gone now.
Now, this, of course, is just the latest in a growing list of companies ending their DEI policies, in large part because of Starbucks' own exposés, like the one you just saw. Those include companies like Lowe's, John Deere, Tractor Supply, and so much more. In fact, Starbucks just released a report on Toyota as of this morning, and that's going to be a really big catch if he can manage to pull it off, because one, it's a big company, and two, its consumer base is pretty much everyone. It's not just conservatives, unlike these other companies he's been going after.
Yeah, so we'll have to see if Toyota wants to be politically neutral or if they, double down on their decision.
That's right. That's the big question.
All right, that's our program for today. Thank you so much for joining us. And we would like to remind you that FISM News is airing its final show this Friday, that is tomorrow, September 27th. But you can still support the ministry through FISM's financial issues.
That's right. As you've noticed, we're still airing our show all this week, but we do have that very special program tomorrow to say goodbye. You don't want to miss it. But for now, thank you so much. God bless, and we will see you tomorrow with our final show.